How's it going, everybody? Very welcome to this evening's Shebeen. I'm Barry Chandler. We're going to have some crack tonight, talking about whiskey tastings and selecting the best, crafting the best Irish whiskey tasting lineup for your whiskey tastings, for your friends, your family, yourself, whomever it may be. So whatever is in your glass tonight, I'd love to know whether you're drinking a drop of single pot still or malt or grain or blends. I always love to know what's in your glass and let us know where you're joining us from. Early hello to Lauren and Greg and T. Cody and Fat Daddy and Richard. You're all very welcome, and looking forward to spending the next while with you all, sipping on a bit of Irish whiskey. I'm starting my night with a drop of Thomond Gate. This is the Ruby Port edition, Ruby Port cask finish, single malt from Thomond Gate Irish Whiskey. Nick Ryan has crafted this, and this is the first one that was shipped to the United States. It's actually still available if you're interested. It's a lovely drop, single malt, cask strength, and available at Folsom Wine and Spirits in California, and they ship to 46 or 47 states last time I checked. So I'm sipping on a drop of that. So Sláinte. Busy week in the world of Irish whiskey. Today is Sunday. A lot of sore heads around Ireland today, recovering from a weekend at Whiskey Live, Ireland's largest whiskey gathering. 50 plus brands, more, maybe 100 brands was there, across the 2 days in Dublin's RDS, Royal Dublin Showgrounds, gathered, and hundreds and hundreds of whiskey fans from around the world gathered. I know some of our Stories and Sips whiskey community are in Ireland at the moment who are at Whiskey Live. So hopefully everyone had a good time. It's a great week. It's a great event. It's a great opportunity to meet those who you've only met online or sample whiskies from brands you've only come across maybe in stores, but you've never met the people behind them. And so I'd encourage everybody at some point to go to Whiskey Live in Dublin if you have the chance and the opportunity, and you'll meet all of your fellow whiskey fans from around Ireland and around the world. Tonight, we are going to share with you a few things. One is the latest Irish whiskey releases, those that have come out over the past week or being announced or that we've had the chance to taste and try. So I'll talk a little bit about those. I also want to spend most of this evening talking about whiskey tasting and crafting a whiskey tasting lineup. I got into Irish whiskey through having to put together my own Irish whiskey tasting, knowing nothing about it, which I'll share more details of in a few minutes. But whiskey tastings are a great way to introduce more people to Irish whiskey, your friends, your family, or they're a great way for you to expand your own horizon by building your own whiskey tasting lineup. So that's what tonight's going to be about, and we'll dive into that in a minute. But again, some more welcomes to those who've joined. We've got Caroline here, who says, don't sample the very best first. I made that mistake on St. Patrick's Day. Okay, very good. Let me see. T. Cody is joining us from a windswept and rain-lashed Nova Scotia. Excellent. That sounds like perfect whiskey drinking weather. Rich is joining us with a Dunville's 10-year-old PX. Excellent. Tom has got a big pour of Shortcross. Excellent. I have my next bottle of Shortcross ready to open right here. I haven't popped it, the cork on it yet. I was wondering, should I do that tonight? It might happen. It might happen. Depends how I get through this one first. The old drop of Ruby Port cask from Thomond Gate. Michael has got a drop of Dingle single malt core release. Lovely. That's a great addition to the Dingle lineup. There's Amy joining us from Phoenix. Hi, Amy. Good evening to you. And Bill with a drop of the Liberator Tawny Port Finish Batch 2. I have a drop of Liberator here as well, which I might get to, which is the Malt and Muscatel. We might get to that. Jeff is having a bit of Teeling Ruby Port, single cask. Excellent. Jennifer's got some Ahru Anacuna tonight from Lochgill Distillery, now owned by Sazerac up in Sligo in Ireland's northwest. We'll be hearing interesting things from them in the coming months. Johnny's sipping Jameson single pot still. I had a drop of that on Friday night. I sipped on it and thought, you know what, I'm going to try this in some cocktails, and made old fashions for a bunch of friends and family on Friday night with Jameson single pot still, and I went down a treat. The sweetness of the virgin oak really worked in an old fashioned. So I love that Jameson single pot still almost through one of my bottles. David Stewart is joining us with Teeling single pot still cask strength through Total Wine. Excellent, at home in Los Angeles. And Greg is drinking a bottle of a drop of Middleton Very Rare 2021. Excellent. I had a drop of the 2023 on Thursday night. Loved it. All right, lots of you in the got some great whiskies. Paul Costello, time for a cup of tea after Whiskey Live. I've never seen Paul Costello with a cup of tea, so things must be bad. Kristen is joining us from Dublin. She came all the way from upstate New York for Whiskey Live. Hope you enjoyed yourself, Kristen. And Kevin's joining us from Austin with a drop of green spot. I had to drop a green spot in my hand earlier. Quail's Gate. It's up on my shelf back here that I almost pulled out for tonight. I might yet get to it. Quail's Gate making its way across the United States at the moment, which is the latest wine cask finish release from Green Spot, which is a collaboration with Quail's Gate Winery in Canada. Steve is joining us, our admin of our Irish Whiskey Fans of America group, starting with a Bushmills highball as he just finished cutting the grass. Now, there you go. He's starting off slow. All righty. So, if you just joined us, you're very welcome. We're going to talk about whiskey tastings, crafting a whiskey tasting lineup, and creating a great experience, a great event for you, for your guests, whomever you choose to share Irish whiskey with. What's going to be interesting about tonight is that I can't tell you, despite this being an Irish whiskey tasting lineup session, I won't be able to tell you what whiskies to choose because I don't know where you are, what whiskies are available, what your budgets are. However, I will be sharing with you all the steps needed to be able to choose the whiskies yourself. And I think that's far more important. The whole don't buy a man a fish, but teach a man how to fish kind of thing. So that's what tonight's going to be about. So I won't be saying to you now, definitely choose this whiskey and definitely choose that whiskey because there are so many variables. And we'll go into that over the course of the next 7, 8, 9 hours as we work through the overview of how to craft a winning Irish whiskey tasting lineup. All right. We've had over the past 4 or 5 sessions, we haven't had a session yet in the past 4 or 5 where audio hasn't failed us somehow, whether it's me knocking out the wires or hitting the mute button or frayed wires on one of the microphones. So if the mic goes out tonight, it's an awful omen that we can't do a live stream without the audio being perfect. But hopefully we'll keep an eye on things anyway. We'll see how we go. All right, and there's Julie joining us from Columbus with a drop of Shorecross. Excellent. We have it right here, Julie. We might get onto it next. All right, so we're going to start this evening by talking a little bit about whiskey news and what's happening in the world of whiskey. I teased this image during the week in our Irish Whiskey Fans of America Facebook group and on our Stories and Sips social media channels. Those of you who recognize this label are very excited. We're in the final days of putting together the logistics and all of the various bits and pieces to announcing our next Stories and Sips Whiskey Club exclusive bottling. And our Stories and Sips Whiskey Club bottlings are exclusive to us. Nobody else in the world gets access to the same liquid. We work with distilleries and brands to source, to find interesting whiskies that we can bring exclusively to our Stories and Sips Whiskey Club. And our next one is almost ready. It's our oldest release yet. Toying with the idea of giving you the age of it, but I don't want to share all the details with you yet, but some of you will recognize that label. It's a beautiful label for a beautiful bottle, and I'm very excited about our next collaboration. Many fans of this brand in the audience, and look, we're nothing if we're not showmen here. We're always trying to build up a bit of excitement, a bit of hype leading up to a release, and it's no different now, which means I'm not just going to say exactly what we've got there. All I can say is that we tasted 6 different whiskey samples and 3 trusted palates sampled all 6 whiskey palates and unanimously came back with the same whiskey and as being the one that they would choose to release. And I'm excited that we're getting to release this in very limited quantities, and it's something that will be hopefully available to be in your hands in the next 3 to 4 weeks. But we'll be announcing it. What we'll be doing something different with this because there's some interesting logistics that are still being finalized. But what we'll probably be doing this week is we'll be announcing the pre-sale date. In other words, we'll be able to pre-order it, and then based on the pre-orders, we'll ship within, I think, 2 weeks of that. So I'll share all those logistics with you, and then we'll roll from that release into another release and another release after that. They'll move a little bit quicker. So this is coming. It's exciting. Some of you will recognize the label. I don't mind if you stick it in the comments. I'm not going to share all the details of it yet. I like a little bit of mystery before we release a bottle. But I will say, all I'll say is it's our oldest whiskey release yet. And it is one that I'm extremely excited about because it allows us to talk and explore very interesting angles and options and stories and people and brands and history around Irish whiskey. And all of our sips are surrounded by stories, and they wouldn't be the same without them. So this is coming. We'll be able to announce hopefully this week. Hopefully, I'm traveling Tuesday to Sunday, but in the middle of travel, we'll be able to hopefully announce it as well. So get excited. Get excited. Lisa says, made it. Looks like at the right time to love that label. Yeah, so this particular label, I won't share any more details. Look, the more I talk, the more I share. But that label signifies for this specific brand that this whiskey is only available in one single outlet location. Like, it's not available in stores, it's not available in multiple outlets. It is designed, destined, bottled for one destination. That one destination being us, the Stories and Sips Whiskey Club. And we will be the first whiskey club in the United States to get one of these. So anyway, exciting times. We went with flavor as opposed to Steve saying he's hoping it's a certain thing, a certain cask. And we chose blind. We had many different options on what we went with this, and the choice was blind. There was only one way to do it. There were so many great options, and I didn't want to be led, and I didn't want the panel to be led by any hype or any age or any price or anything that might be considered trendy or topical at the moment. Instead, we said we want the best nose, palate, finish combination. We want that. I want the notes and I want the feedback, and this is what we came back with. Some of you might be surprised by what we ended up with, but we went with flavor above all else. That's it. Sinead, not telling any more about it. All right. For those of you who are part of our Stories and Sips Whiskey Club, you'll be interested in this. Whiskey Chats podcast, Laurie O'Dwyer hosts that. We hosted a tasting, the first ever side-by-side tasting of all of the Stories and Sips Whiskey Club bottlings ever released, from going all the way back to the Story 2 years ago, and also including the Talnua single pot still release for our Irish whiskey fans of America and our Stories and Sips fans. We had 6 different whiskies that we brought into Cork in Ireland for the Cork Whiskey Society, who themselves are members of our whiskey club and have been buying up our bottles. And we did a tasting side by side. The entire tasting is now available online on Spotify and iTunes. Just look for the Whiskey Chats podcast link, and you will hear a very long podcast as I talk for hours about our 6 whiskies. And a comment was made on Twitter correctly that by David Morrow, one of our friends, and he said he's 20 minutes in and he still hasn't got to the first whiskey. And somebody responded and said that he was an hour late for the whiskey tasting and still didn't miss a single whiskey. There was a lot to talk about, a lot of stories to tell, but we tasted great whiskies. And it was interesting to hear people in Ireland tasting Irish whiskies that had all gone out to the United States for our whiskey club predominantly. And it was the first time that they'd ever been tasted side by side. So that might be something you might find interesting on your commute, or when you're cutting the grass next, or you're trying to fall asleep. I'm sure that my voice will do that to you. So Whiskey Chats podcast, worth checking out for that. Now, let's talk about some whiskey releases this week. Method and Madness announced a new release, which is coming to the United States. So it's particularly interesting to those of you who are joining us from the United States. It is a single pot still. It's about 6 years old, and it is produced entirely in the micro distillery in Middleton. Now, not all Method and Madness releases have come from the micro distillery. In fact, only 2 of them, I think, so far have. This is a micro distilled, triple distilled, small batch, like 2,500 liter stills compared to 80,000 liter stills in the main distillery, aged for about 6 years in bourbon barrels, and then transferred to virgin Gariana oak, which is a oak species, a white oak species native to the Pacific Northwest. In this case, it was Oregon Gariana oak, also known as Oregon oak, and virgin, so never used before. Transferred into those barrels for between 4 and 12 months. I think about 26 or 27 barrels in total is all that was used in this release, but it's coming to the United States later in the year. Let me tell you, it's my favorite Method and Madness release that is sub 100 euros ever, honestly. And my previous favorite was the French Chestnut. Half of my bottle is already gone, and I've shared it with folks who are very surprised at the sweetness, the flavor, just a harmonious nature of the nose and the palate on this. It's a wonderful spice, but there's also really interesting sweetness. It's almost like a golden syrup or a treacle sweetness that's so it's so present, and there's such a length to it. There's even almost like a kind of a not quite smoky, but there's a kind of a burnt character to it. It's really, really unique and well worth checking out when it comes to the United States. So that's released in Ireland for €95 this week. So if you're buying things from Ireland, as many of you do, you can ship it to yourselves or wait until later in the year. Wherever Method of Madness lands, I don't know where it lands in the States at various times because it's impossible to keep up, but it's worth checking out. Worth checking out. A few of you have already tasted it. Lauren tasted it, says it's stunning. Michael says, lucky to taste a Whiskey Live, fantastic stuff. And some of you have already explored Westland whiskey. Yeah, it does a Gariana matured whiskey each year. So they would have spearheaded, I think, the use of Gariana in whiskey maturation, Westland up there in Portland in Oregon. Michael says, I think it's time to buy a warehouse and start sourcing your own barrels. Michael, we've already started sourcing our own barrels, and they're in different warehouses around Ireland. So at some point, they'll all come together, and we'll be maybe a subtenant in a warehouse, and we'll have our Stories and Sips barrels there. Next up is Redbreast Dream Cask. So Redbreast every year for the past 5 years have released what they call a Dream Cask, and that started 6 years ago now, when Billy Lighton for World Whiskey Day in 2017, if I recall correctly, 2016, I think, 2017, maybe 2017. Billy Lighton and Dave McCabe announced a 32-year-old Dream Cask, which is a Redbreast Dream Cask. In other words, the best of all of the available stocks that could be released as a Dream Redbreast. And they've continued that every single year with Redbreasts of varying ages and various maturation profiles and various barrels and etc. and casks being used in their maturation. They tend to have they've leaned on port quite a bit in the past few years, and this year is no different. They have 870 bottles of this whiskey that go available to a ballot, or available to enter a ballot tomorrow, May 22nd, on the Redbreast website. The downside is that it's only available to those who have an Irish mobile phone number and an Irish address to be able to ship it to, but some of you will get creative and figure that out. But I got to taste this in Dublin on Thursday alongside the Method and Madness, and this one is a port. They're calling it port to port edition. It's the first ever Redbreast that has no sherry cask component in it. So it's all pot still whiskey aged between 27 and 28 years, 2 different casks, a 27-year-old bourbon cask, bourbon barrel, and a 28-year-old port cask were married together to create this. No sherry component, which is a first for Redbreast because the DNA of Redbreast is sherry as a backbone, fortified wine, but predominantly sherry. This one has no sherry, so you're missing the almond notes, you're missing the dark fruit notes, and I think you're actually missing some of the length. I tasted this, and it's not my favorite of the Dream Casks. In fact, for the price, which is I think €580, I'd probably choose the Redbreast 27 over it. But it is I found this to be maybe a little bit thin, a little bit short on the finish, and maybe I think quite a different whiskey than the other 5 that were released. And I've tried all 5 of the Dream Casks. I'm a fan of the series. This one wouldn't be my favorite of them. In fact, between that and the Method of Madness on the night, I went with the Method of Madness and said that was my favorite. So I thought this was a bit light, or a bit maybe short, a bit thin, and not my ideal Redbreast. But each to their own. There was others who said it was their favorite Dream Cask that they'd ever tried. So that goes available tomorrow. Method of Madness at the Redbreast Birdhouse, which is their website. Just Google Redbreast Birdhouse and you'll find the website and you can register. Next one is this is called Ogham, Ogham, which is the old Irish lettering, which was, you'll see it around Ireland in really kind of not quite prehistoric, but ancient tombs have these little lines. So let me see if I can zoom in on this a small bit. You'll see there on the front, there's kind of a tall rock, and they have little etchings in there, little lines, and those were, it was an ancient form of communication in Ireland, letters that were that could be put together based on the number of lines that were on either side of a tall rock. Anyway, Ogham is a lettering, it's a language that is being showcased or represented in this whiskey, which was released by a couple of rugby players in Ireland, the Levy brothers, Dan Levy and Adam Levy. They released this 7-year-old single malt, which just only had 1,000 bottles, and it sold out very quickly. It sold out, I think, in about 24 hours. So that was released this week as well. Didn't get to try it. Nice packaging, nice bottle, nice little sack that comes with it, a little Hessian sack that you can put it in. and a lot of work has clearly gone into the bottling and the packaging. My understanding is that there's more whiskies to come. So if you're interested and you're a rugby fan, you want to get hold of that, the Levy brothers will happily sell you a bottle when it comes available next again, I'm pretty sure. So those are the three main releases actually this week. That's it. The Method of Madness, OM Single Malt, and the Redbreast Dream Cask. So if you're interested in the Redbreast Dream Cask ballot, May 22nd, that's tomorrow, Monday, it'll be available to you. Okay. Yeah, sold out everywhere, Steve. It was available on their website, which was linked to Irish Malts, and Irish Malts had their own separate stock of it, but completely sold out, not available anywhere else. So the only place to find that now would be on auction, I would say, if you want it at all. All right, let's get on to the main thrust of things. I'm sipping on a drop of the old Thomond Gate single malt from Nick Ryan, Thomond Gate Irish Whiskey. This is a Ruby Port single cask, single malt, single cask, and it is aged in bourbon to begin with and then finished in Ruby Port. And it is available in the United States, Folsom Wine and Spirits. Nick Ryan from Thomond Gate. It's his first release in the United States. Worth checking out. So, sláinte. All right. All right, this is the main part of our night. We're going to spend the next 42 hours on this. Steve, I'd say you're not short of a bottle of whiskey now. I've seen your shelves. That's the common refrain when we can't get a whiskey we want. We say, sure, look, we have to drink out of the 100 bottles that we have, so or the 20 bottles that we have. Tough out life for those who've gone down the slippery slope of trying to chase whiskies and get deeper into the world of Irish whiskey. It's a very slippery, expensive slope, isn't it? When I got into Irish whiskey through whiskey tastings and through my own whiskey tastings that I had to self-teach myself on and learn from those kind of around me and read online, watch YouTube videos, and going all the way back to 2016. So living in Columbus, Ohio, where I'd been living full-time since 2006. And I'd been taking part every year in a charity bicycle ride, a bike ride called Pelotonia, a fundraiser which was set up to raise money for cancer research. And for those of you familiar with Ohio, I'm familiar with Columbus, and hopefully you're not familiar with cancer, but if you are, you may be familiar with the James Cancer Hospital and Solov Research Institute in Columbus, Ohio, one of the best research institutes in the United States for cancer. They needed to raise a lot of money to continue their high risk, high reward cancer research. And so this bike ride was started by trustees and friends of the hospital with the goal of raising millions of dollars over the years. And what started as a small grassroots bike ride going back now 12 years, grew into 8,000 riders, 9,000 riders in one weekend, riding anywhere from 20 miles to 180 miles. It was a community effort and something that really got me excited about living in Ohio and helped me be part of the community by joining others who were training all year and joining training rides and group rides that would go out every night in the evenings or on a Saturday morning. And to participate in it, you had to raise anywhere from, I think it was $1,200 going all the way up to $2,000 or $3,000, depending on the distance that you rode. But the beauty of it was that every single cent raised would go to cancer research. So 100% of the money would go to cancer research, and the cost of running the charity was underwritten by businesses in Ohio, which was a unique charity structure and gave confidence to people donating money because they knew that every single cent was going directly to the hospital to fund researchers and equipment and scientists to be able to dive into addressing the challenges associated with the cancers that were being treated. So I was part of it for 6 years. I'd ridden every single year, and in 2016, I remember it had reached the stage where there was 8,000 riders now, and it became tough to ask people for money. Hey, can you sponsor me? Give me $20, give me $10. And people were, the thing I was hearing the most was that, I just sponsored John, or I just sponsored Mary, I just sponsored Sheila. And so there were so many people getting sponsorship that I thought, how am I going to raise this money? I think I had to raise at the time about $2,300 to enter it. And again, all that money was going to cancer research. So somebody, and I wish I remembered who it was, suggested to me that I should do a whiskey tasting, and an Irish whiskey tasting specifically. And my first response was, sure, I don't know anything about Irish whiskey. How would I do that? And I didn't. It was 2016. I wasn't a big Irish whiskey fan. I sipped on a bit of Jameson Black Barrel. I'd sip on Jack Daniels and Coke. Was kind of something I would drink, but I didn't know really anything about styles of whiskey or anything like that. But I said, I don't know anything about Irish whiskey. And the response was, but you have an Irish accent. And I said, you're right. Good enough. I'll do it. So I went to the local supermarket, Giant Eagle, 3rd Avenue, Columbus, Ohio, in Grandview. Many of you will be familiar with it if you're from Ohio. And I just found 6 interesting looking labels of whiskies that were on the shelf. Jameson, Bushmills Original. There was a West Cork whiskey. There was maybe a Jameson Caskmates. This was a really primitive lineup of whiskies I found. 6 whiskies. I thought, all right, they seem interesting. I brought them home and I Googled each one of them and started writing notes. What are they? Okay, the West Cork has an interesting label with the coast of Cork on the label. That's interesting. We'll talk about that. Oh, look, it's founded by 3 fishermen or 2 fishermen and their friend. All right, we'll talk about the fishermen, And I got excited. And so I invited friends to join a whiskey tasting. And I told them, hey, I don't know much about whiskey, but I need to raise money for cancer. If you give me $50, I'll give you 6 whiskeys. And they said, sold. And they came to my first whiskey tasting in Ohio. That was in June 2016. And I got lots of questions at this whiskey tasting about the whiskeys. Where did they come from? How were they made? I hadn't a clue. So I had to go home and Google this again, YouTube it, and I would send the answers to people and say, guess what? Jameson's from Middleton. Amazing. Should have known these things, right? And somebody said, what's a single pot still? I said, I don't know what a single pot still is. Oh, I've discovered it. And I'd send them a message or on Facebook or an email or a text or something. And this first night was a success. We raised a few $100s. I gave all the money to cancer research. I did another one the next night, and another one the night after that. And it started gathering steam. And somebody asked if you'd do one for my company and if you'd do one for my family, would you come to our house and do a tasting? And I didn't know a whole lot about whiskey, but each whiskey tasting I was learning. And I was going home and I was finding more information, and it got me interested in Irish whiskey. It got me feeling even more proud of Ireland. It got me feeling more proud of the things we produce in Ireland. I was living in the States for 10 years at that stage, and I thought, this is amazing. This is really, really fun and interesting. And I like the whiskeys. I like meeting people, and we're doing a good thing. We're raising a bit of money. So I started down my path of Irish whiskey knowledge and just gaining some experience with each tasting I did. I've done now about 300 tastings over the past 6 or 7 years, charity tastings, corporate tastings, you name it, family, friends, online tastings. I did 200 of them over the course of COVID, all around for people all over the world, different times. And I've learned something from every single tasting. And I've built an approach and a format that has really worked for the tastings that I want to share with you tonight. It doesn't mean it's the only format. It doesn't mean that I have it all figured out, but I want to share with you how I do it, why I do it the way I do it, the decisions I make along the way, and then you can decide what works for you. But I want tonight to be about you and not just the things I do, because this is only what works for me. You will say to me, but actually I've got different thoughts and I've got different interests. Great. Put in the comments what you want to talk about and the goals you have for a whiskey tasting, and we'll build it around you. So tonight we're going to talk about crafting a whiskey lineup, but it's not just going to be about choose these whiskeys, because I think that's, dare I say, the whiskeys themselves can almost be secondary to the experience of it all. I've been at amazing experiences with poor whiskeys, and I've been at poor experiences with amazing whiskeys. And I think the two things have to be in place. You have to have good whiskeys and you have to have a good experience. But the most important thing is that people have fun. So we're going to talk about how to choose the whiskeys, but we're also going to talk about how do you make this event for anybody, like your friends, your family, yourselves, your co-workers. Maybe you're doing a charity fundraiser. How do you make it like an enjoyable and educational event all at the same time? So that's what I'll share tonight. But any question you have, throw it in there into the comments and I'll answer it. And anything we can do to help you build a whiskey tasting for your friends and your family, then we'll solve it together tonight. I know there's some of you in the group that already do whiskey tastings, which is fantastic. And I've watched with great joy as people who've come into our whiskey community have asked questions, have listened, have learned, have bought whiskeys, have listened to feedback, have shared their feedback, and are now hosting their own whiskey tastings. And that's the great hope that I have is that as more and more people maybe get confident enough to talk about the whiskies, that they'll bring maybe their friends to their house and they'll talk about the whiskies. Or in some cases, we've got folks who now host whiskies at their host whiskey tastings at their local bars. And for that, like, kudos. It's a big thing, no small undertaking, but like, fair play to you. You're all spreading the word of Irish whiskey, and that's all that we can hope. That's all that we can hope. All right. Kevin says he met Barry through one of those corporate online tastings. Kevin, you did. And you're a great example of someone who has followed that journey and kind of fallen in love with Irish whiskey. And now you're going to great lengths to be involved with Irish whiskey, as we know. So fair play to you, Kevin. Fat Barry. Fat Daddy says, I met Barry at a tasting in Columbus just before the pandemic shut the world down. So we did lots of in-person tastings around Ohio before the pandemic, and then after the pandemic or during the pandemic, most of the tastings turned online, and now we occasionally do them in person, don't we, for our whiskey club as well. But look, it's all about having fun is the most important thing. So look, here's what we're going to talk about. I'll put things up on the screen and we'll take your questions as we go. But the first thing I want to talk about is that I'm not a whiskey expert. I think you all know by now that, and just by sharing that story of how I came into whiskey, I'm not a trained academic. I don't have a qualification in whiskey. I don't have a qualification in anything. I didn't go to college. I don't have a qualification. I don't have a piece of paper I can show you and say I'm qualified to talk about whiskey. But what I do have is a passion, and that passion has got me into trouble and into great rooms full of people all at the same time. And I'm not an expert, and I don't think I kind of operate from that place of there is no such thing as a whiskey expert. There's just people who know more than other people, and there's others who know less than other people. So I live by the mantra that in the world of the second grader, the third grader is king. We all know a little bit more than the person who doesn't know as much, and we can all learn from the next person as well. So I'm very clear on that. You'll never hear me call myself a whiskey expert. I'm an enthusiast and I'm passionate, and every tasting I learn something new, and every person I talk to in the whiskey world teaches me something new. I think that's an important thing that helps when you're hosting tastings, that's kind of clear that you're not an expert. And if you don't, I always say at the start of my tastings, if you have a question and I can't answer it, I'll find the answer and I'll get it to you later. I'm not going to make it up, even though I have an accent, and I could. All right. So when we think about whiskey tastings and whiskey lineups, we should maybe define what a whiskey tasting is. Like, there's no doubt that you could put on a blindfold, go be directed to your whiskey shelf by a loved one who ensures you don't fall over bricks and things on the floor before getting there. And you could put out your hands and you could grab 3 or 4 or 5, 6 bottles and you could bring them back to a table. Now you've got a whiskey tasting lineup. There is no right or wrong way to have a lineup. But what we do want to do is think about what are the criteria that might change the outcome of a lineup or might affect a lineup. So I would differentiate a whiskey tasting from just sipping whiskey to be a whiskey tasting is drinking whiskey with a goal. We're trying to do something with that tasting, whether it's to further our education, whether it's to hang out with friends, whatever it is. It's typically a goal with a whiskey tasting. But you can start small with this and we can build from there. My first ever tasting, I think the sum total of the whiskeys I bought was about $120, maybe $150 was what 6 whiskeys cost me to buy. Not a lot of money for 6 whiskeys. I've also done tastings where the whiskeys have combined to cost $50,000 to $55,000 for a tasting. But you can start small and you can build from there. The thing I always ask first when I think about when I'm thinking about a whiskey tasting is, what is that goal? And it's going to dictate everything we do when we build out a whiskey tasting. So if any of you now are thinking about a whiskey tasting, maybe for your friends or your family or co-workers or whomever, like, if you're willing to throw in the comments what you'd like that tasting to achieve, we'll use that information to help us as we go through this as well, right? So I'll craft it towards what you're trying to do. Maybe you're saying, I want to get more people aware of Irish whiskey, which is a noble goal and something we can all support. Or maybe you're saying, I just want to have a bit of crack with my friends. Brilliant. Throw that in the comments as well. But if you have a particular goal in mind with a whiskey tasting, let me know, and I'll do my best to answer that as well. So maybe your goal is a charity fundraiser. Like, that was my first goal. That's what got me into whiskey tasting. And interestingly, and I've shared a story in the past, I think by the time I did my 4th tasting back in 2016, I was putting pictures of it up on social media, and I was like Instagram, I had like a personal Instagram account at the time. There was no such thing as stories and sips at the time. It was just me having a bit of crack with whiskey. And I remember tagging my pictures with things like Irish Whiskey Ohio. Anyway, I got a message from a distributor in Ohio who was distributing Irish whiskey on Instagram saying, hey, we noticed you're using some of our whiskeys in a whiskey tasting. We want to talk to you. And I thought, oh God, should I not be using these whiskeys? I freaked out. I thought, maybe I'm doing something wrong here. Am I treading on somebody's toes? And turns out that they wanted to talk to me about how to support the efforts of fundraising and sharing the pictures online and educating people more. And it wasn't a kind of a threatening message at all, but it started out as kind of charity fundraising, and that got the attention of the distributor. So look, you might have a different reason for doing a whiskey tasting. Whatever it is, it's entirely up to you why you want to do it. There's no right or wrong way. A bit of fun with friends, maybe it's educational, or like in the case of some people, there's a particular brand that they love. I know people who love the Powers brand. I know people who love the Dunvilles brand. I know people who love the Jameson brand. And I see this all the time where people go down a path and they follow all of the releases from a certain brand, and they're evangelists for the brand, and they go out and they want other people to try this brand. Cologne, 2 Stacks, these are very cult-like brands as well that get a good cult following. So maybe you want to share them with friends, but whatever the goal is, it's important that you start with that, because there's no such thing as just a whiskey tasting. There's a goal that the whiskey tasting helps you achieve. Mine was to raise money for cancer research when I first started it. It changes with every single tasting I do. I do a lot of corporate events now, and where clients want to entertain their own customers. And those are very different goals, because there might be different budgets available for buying whiskeys than there are if somebody was saying, look, I just need to raise money for a GoFundMe for medical treatment or something, and there might not be a lot of money available for the whiskeys, And so we're crafting an event and experience around it, and all of our whiskeys are going to be determined ultimately by what the goal is. So whatever the goal is, start with that, right? And put that down. And yeah, so if you have any goals you want to throw in there or any questions as we go, like share them in the comments, by all means, and we'll work around those. When I'm thinking about a whiskey tasting, and I suggest to you, and again, these are all suggestions. I don't have all the answers. You might have a much better way of doing it than I do. But it's important to remember that you're not your audience. If you're introducing people to Irish whiskey, they're going to have a very different background and approach and runway towards that tasting than you have. So if you're used to drinking 30-year-old Bushmills and 27-year-old Redbreasts all the time, your experience will be very different to those who are coming to a tasting for the first time who maybe don't have an experience with Irish whiskey. So the first thing is to consider, who is it that's coming to your whiskey tasting? Because it's not you. You're the one who's going to talk about the whiskeys, but I can assure you, you're going to drink the least out of all of the guests because you'll be so busy talking. And look, I'm here now, we're half an hour in or 40 minutes in, and I haven't even made a little dent in my little glass, because we do all the talking when you're hosting a tasting. So the first thing is, you're not the audience. And once you can separate yourself and put yourself in their shoes and think, who are they? What's their experience like? Are they just beer drinkers historically? Maybe you know things about them. Maybe you know that Jim is an IPA drinker, and you might say, Joe, what I'm going to do now for Jim, I'm going to choose a Caskmates IPA because Jim is an IPA drinker, and there's a little bridge for Jim into Irish whiskey. Or you might discover that somebody else is a bourbon drinker, and that might inform what you're going to choose for your whiskeys as you go down the road to selecting the lineup of whiskeys as well. But you're not your audience. So figure out who you're doing this for. You can just do it for yourself too. Like, you could line up 6 20-year-old single malts from different distilleries and brands alongside one another and taste them. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. So you might be the audience, but if you're hosting a whiskey tasting and creating a lineup to introduce others to Irish whiskey, the chances are you're not the audience. Caroline tried to convert her nephew from bourbon. Didn't work. Caroline, maybe by the end of this, we might have some more, you might have some more artillery in your arsenal to be able to use. Amy says, we had a tasting with Mick's daughter and fiance. We used a flavor wheel to try and discover what we were tasting. It was fun. Yes. Daniel says, I've yet to see a bourbon drinker not get wide-eyed on Redbreast cask strength. So these are great things to know. And whenever I'm hosting a tasting with clients, or where I don't know the audience, I'll ask the client to share with me as much information as they can about the people. Like, can you find out, has somebody ever been to Ireland? Have they an experience with Irish whiskey? Are they wine drinkers? Are they tequila drinkers, what can we find out about the people? Because then we can personalize our tasting to them. The more information we have, the more we can personalize it and make it feel like this tasting is designed for you. And it's a chance to get people into Irish whiskey in a way that's more, perhaps fewer barriers, lower barrier to, or there's less resistance, because you're helping them understand things maybe in terms they're already familiar with. Budget and availability are, of course, very, very important. If your goal is to introduce people to Irish whiskey and you want them to be able to find that whiskey again locally, there's no point in lining up a selection of whiskies that are not going to be available in the state and that are only available in Celtic Whiskey Shop in Dublin, and that's it. That's grand if you want to introduce people to whiskies that they can't get locally, but we must consider the budget and availability. Again, I've done tastings where there was $100 available for whiskies. I've done tastings where there's $50,000 available for whiskies, and everything in between. And the budget and the availability are going to matter. That, combined with the audience, are going to help you understand, as we get to the point of choosing the whiskies and crafting the whiskey selection, what's most important to them. Remember, if we're trying to evangelize Irish whiskey, and again, I'm using just one hypothetical situation, which is that you want to hold a whiskey tasting to get more people introduced or fall in love with Irish whiskey, then we're going to have to remove as many barriers as possible. If you get somebody to love a whiskey and it's out of production, it's no longer made, like you might say, I've got 3 great whiskies. They're called the Jameson Maker Series, Cooper's Crows, and Distiller's Safe, and Blender's Dog. I'm going to use them in a tasting. And your guest might say, these are amazing. Where can we get them? And you say, I'm sorry, they're not made anymore. And it's a big kind of anticlimax. So we want people to, if the goal is to get them introduced, where are those whiskies available? Now, the budget is going to vary. So you're going to have your own budget. I know there's some of you here in the audience that will have $1,000 for tasting, and some of you that will have $100 for tasting. And there's no right or wrong way, but you need to know what that budget is so you can allocate it accordingly. And we don't want to blow all our budget on one bottle, and we want to spread it out so that we can spend the money in the right way and allocate it accordingly. So now we've got some information, like we know what the goal of our tasting is. We know who our people are who are coming. We know how much we want to spend, and we know if the whiskies are or are not potentially, or we know what availability there is locally. I know in Ohio, for example, you can go on the Ohio State Liquor Board's website, ohlq.com. You can find the list of the 90 plus Irish whiskies that are available in the state, and you can even map out where they are for sale, whether they're in Cleveland or Columbus or Dayton or Coshocton or anywhere else. And you'll be able to share that with your guests as well, or direct them to the website. And Philadelphia, actually Pennsylvania has a website like that, and other states have lists as well of what's available locally. That changes as well, but in any case, consider the budget and consider the availability. All right, was there a question there from Rob? Rob says, I'm lining up a Powers tasting for July here. Interested to pick out 4 bottles of Powers and get some ideas on food pairings if you have some. Okay, so I won't have a lot to talk about on food pairings tonight. We'll do a tasting on food pairings separately. Interested to pick out 4 bottles of Powers. There are only 4 bottles of Powers. There are Powers Rye, Powers Gold, Powers John's Lane, and Powers 3 Swallow, which would be a great lineup, honestly. A rye, a blend, and 2 pot stills. That'd be a great tasting. I would get those 4. Of course, there are single casks available out there, but again, availability, if you think about Japan, certainly those wouldn't be easily obtained. But that would be a great tasting. Powers Rye, Powers Gold, Powers John's Lane, Powers 3 Swallow. We'll talk about sequencing in a second and what order to put whiskies as well. Yeah, let me just quickly look at some of the comments. There's Lauren is solving that with some of the food pairings. Very good. Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, there's 39 single cask Powers out there of varying levels of availability. 39, and no sign of that ending anytime soon either, I don't think. So let's talk a little bit about choosing your whiskies then. Now, this one is as long as a piece of string, which whiskies to choose. I've got a plan for how I typically approach an entry-level introduction to Irish whiskey, where I don't know if people are interested in Irish whiskey. Maybe they were invited to an event. So, for example, if I'm doing a corporate event with a company that says, I want to entertain my customers, I want to send them some whiskeys, and I want them to have a good time, and we'll send them a selection of whiskeys. I'm choosing whiskeys that are approachable and that are perhaps entry level or near enough to it, with maybe some surprise or something special as well. But when we choose our whiskeys, there is no one way, but we'll talk about some of the ways that you could do it to form this lineup. But again, we're going to be informed at this stage now by the goal of our tasting, who's coming to the tasting, what amount of money we have available, and what availability there is of these whiskeys later on. Those are things that are going to help inform us. Again, when you start, while there's no one way to do it, getting these things aligned is going to make for a much better experience when it comes time to bringing people around the table to have the whiskey. And once we talk about choosing the whiskeys, we'll talk about what to do with them as we go on. So when my first ever tasting, I chose 6 whiskeys. I think 5 of them were blends and 1 of them was a pot still. The pot still, I think, was Redbreast. The 5 blends, Caskmates, West Cork Bourbon Cask, Jameson, Bushmills Original. In any case, it was a ridiculous lineup when you think of putting it through the lens of what I've even just shared, because it didn't make any sense. There was no thought put into it. It was just find 6 whiskeys, right? But now I would choose a very different lineup. So today, if I'm starting off, I'll choose between 4 and 6 whiskeys, depending on the length of time we've got to do it, depending on who the audience is, the budget, etc. 4 to 6 whiskeys. As a foundation, what I like to do is I like to share all the styles of Irish whiskey. So we have 3 styles of Irish whiskey and 1 unofficial style of Irish whiskey. And I like to share all of them. Let me put this up on the screen here. So I like to start with an example of each style. Again, 3 styles of Irish whiskey, 1 unofficial style, which is just a blend of the other styles. So we've got malt whiskey, or single malt if it's 1 distillery, grain whiskey, or single grain whiskey, pot still whiskey, and then blends. Blend is a combination of any of the previous 3, malt, grain, pot still. So a malt whiskey or a single malt whiskey might be, let's say, a 10-year-old Bushmills, for example, Bushmills single malt. It might be a Dunville's 20-year-old Pedro Jimenez cask single malt. It might be a Tullamore Dew 14-year-old single malt. There's lots of malts out there. We might be a Cooley single malt, like could be a Tyrconnell, or we might decide we want to use something like a peated malt. We might choose maybe a Shortcross single malt from Stories and Sips, or we might do another peated malt like a Bill Phil, for example, from W.D. O'Connell. With grain whiskies, these are going to be a little bit harder to find in certain parts of the United States, but a grain whiskey would be a whiskey or a single grain whiskey made predominantly with corn or maize. So there's Teeling has a single grain. There's 2 stacks of single grain. They're harder to find, but they are one of the styles of Irish whiskey, and I like to choose them or use them when I can. The reality is that if I was to substitute out a grain whiskey for a blended whiskey, I'd only be missing out on about 4 or 5% of the grain. So, for example, you take a regular Jameson. Jameson is about 96% grain whiskey and about 4 or 5% pot still whiskey. So there's a high grain component in there. But then I'm also looking for a pot still whiskey. And I'll talk about why I'm choosing these in a second. But pot still whiskies, of course, are that quintessential style that Ireland is quite known for and is becoming more and more known for. All of the spot whiskies are pot still whiskies. All of the Redbreast whiskies are pot still whiskies or single pot still whiskies. And then I always want to choose a blend. The reality is that most of your audience, if they have ever had an Irish whiskey, it'll have been a blend. It'll have been a Jameson, most likely, a Bushmills, maybe a Powers, maybe a Tullamore Dew, but it's most likely going to have been a Jameson. So that's most Americans' introduction to Irish whiskey, I found, is a blend. And to many Americans, a blend is, or Jameson is the only Irish whiskey, and Irish whiskey means Jameson. There's no familiarity or awareness of these other styles, which is your opportunity. Because now you get to craft a tasting and a lineup showcasing all of the styles of Irish whiskey that exist. Now, again, you've got to come back to what is your budget? How much can you spend on these? And these are going to vary in price and availability. Most states will have an Irish single malt, an Irish pot still, and an Irish blend. Not all states will have a single grain. They might, but not all will. Then you're going to have to look at the pricing of each of these. You could find a blend for $20 and you could find a blend for $200, and they're not all the same, are they? A Hellcat Maggie at $20 won't be the same as a Jameson 18 Bow Street blend. They'll be quite different. Pot still whiskey will range in price from $35 for a Powers 3 Swallow all the way up to $500 for a Redbreast or $600 for a Redbreast 27. So they're not all created equally. And when it comes to the budget, I like to allocate the budget as evenly as possible across the range, except when I want to have a standout whiskey, maybe a surprise whiskey or something special if I'm going beyond 4 whiskeys. But if I'm just doing 4 whiskeys, if I have $200 to spend on 4 whiskeys, I'll maybe spend $40 to $60 on each. And that way, my guests will be able to see the different styles at similar price points. There'll be lots of differences, of course, beyond the price, but that'll be one way for them to choose them. All right, let me take another sip of whiskey here now. I can't be talking all night. And I'm going to take some of your questions before we go on. All right, let me have a look. Lisa wants to know what order would you recommend. So I'm going to get to that. That's one of my next slides, sequencing, what order to pour them in. I know there's lots of impatience here in the comments, wondering which way to do things. Yes, that might be what you're about to tell us, is Lisa. All right, lots of you are solving some questions for yourselves in the audience there. Attic Drams had the chance to taste the single pot still from Boan. Future looks interesting. Very good. Caroline says, how about one whiskey but different finishes? Yeah, absolutely. Those delicious Tyrconnells. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So we're going to start with just one lineup, and we'll talk about a few more. Single grain, Greg got a good recommendation there. That's a good one. Single grain from Method and Madness, which is a lovely, lovely single grain. Fat Daddy says Method and Madness single grain seems to be the most available. Yep, if you can find that, excellent. Lockery is a great shout, says Paul, for a blend. Writer's Tears is Tom's intro blend. Excellent. So I typically avoid Jameson Original when it comes to a whiskey tasting. Not for anything to do with quality or taste. I enjoy Jameson Original. I mostly use it for cocktails like Jameson Coke, Jameson Ginger. I love Jameson Coke, love Jameson Coke. But I typically avoid Jameson because if anyone has ever had an Irish whiskey, that's the one they're most likely to have had. It's 90% of the Irish whiskey market, and it's the one that's going to have been sampled, maybe not sipped, probably shot. But in any case, these are the 4 styles I'm going to start with, right? If I'm doing more than 4 whiskeys, I would never do more than 6. Anything more than 6, you're going to need stretchers and ambulances on standby, because not everybody's used to drinking whiskeys neat or drinking whiskeys at all. So I'll start with this lineup, and again, comes back to budget. I could build you $1,000 tasting lineup with these 4 styles. I could build you $100 lineup with these 4 styles. But you're going to look for each of these. And why you're going to look for each of these is because you're going to be able to tell the story of the different styles and give a broad overview of the Irish whiskey landscape with these. Now, I have a lot more to share. So if you're asking a question about which ones to serve in which order, I'll get to that now in a second, and lots more. But this is where I start. If I'm going to 6 whiskeys, what I'll do is I'll start with the 4. I'll have a malted grain, a pot still, and a blend, and then I'll do maybe 2 other whiskeys that are slightly different. I might have one surprise whiskey or something that's very unusual. Let's say it's something that's finished in an unusual cask, or something that was a very small availability, or something that was a trial, or maybe I got hold of a cask sample, or I found something that was that's not anymore in production, and it might allow us to tell some interesting stories and have an interesting flavor experience. And then I might have one that is a premium whiskey. So if I'm doing $30 to $40 or $40 to $60 bottles on these 4, maybe I've got a $150 bottle for a really high-end pour to close out the night. Like maybe I've got a Blue Spot, or maybe I've got a Redbreast 15, or maybe a Redbreast 21 if I can go all the way up to maybe $200 or $220, depending on what you find things for. Or I might have something that's completely different. Like I might have a peated whiskey that's the last whiskey of the night, because I wouldn't have that before any of the others. So we'll talk about the sequencing in a second. But anyway, I want to cover the basics of Irish whiskey if I'm sharing and trying to introduce people to the category across the 4 styles to begin with. Now, always think about the goals. Again, what are we trying to achieve? Because when you're standing at the shelf, standing in the liquor store, about to order online, you're going to want to know what you're trying to achieve with that tasting before you press buy, because you want to achieve that goal. Introduce people to the category, have a bit of crack, be able to tell a better story, you name it, you already know what your goals are. As we line up these whiskies and get them ready for the event, I always like to encourage questions and encourage feedback. So we're going to talk about the sequencing and how to kind of kick off your event in a second. But back to this thing about there's no such thing as a whiskey expert, or I don't think there is at least. The most I've ever learned about Irish whiskey has come through others sharing with me either things they already knew or things they didn't know that I had to go and research and find out. So I'm always trying to get people to tell me what is not clear. What do you like? What do you want to know? What's missing? Have I explained everything? And that way you get a bit of back and forth going at the same time. The whiskies, of course, are going to depend entirely on your budget and your goals. So I can't tell you which whiskies to buy because I don't know where you are. But if you tell me where you are and what you're trying to do, we'll talk about how we can build that, especially for you. You can also do other tastings beyond this basic entry level tasting, right? Or a basic kind of category awareness of Ireland. So you might decide, you know what, my people are a bit more advanced than that. I want to introduce them to a tasting which takes in 10-year-old Cooley single malts that have been finished in different casks by different blenders or different bonding companies over the years. And I might line up 4 of those, and you can all start with the same distillate, but they had different cask finishes. You might say, I want to do a Green Spot wine cask finish tasting, and I'm going to use Quailsgate, Chateau Lea of the Barton, and Chateau Montelena, and we're going to talk about how regular Green Spot, 7 to 10 years old, changes when it spends 6 to 9 to 12 months in a wine cask. And you'll have a great conversation about that. So if you've got wine-loving friends, that could be a great way to get them into Irish whiskey. Another thing to do could be a vertical tasting within a distillery category. So, or within a distillery, you might decide, or within a brand. For example, I could do a stair-stepped tasting up through Jameson. I could start with Jameson Original. I could move up to Jameson Black Barrel. I could then sample a Cask Mates. I could move on to maybe Jameson Single Pot Still if it was available to me. I could go all the way up to Jameson 18-year-old. And I could tell the story of the Jameson family all the way along. But I could also show what wood finishes and age does to a blend of pot still and grain whiskey along the way as well, in differing quantities and different kind of ratios. What other tastings can I do? Well, I could do a tasting of just pot still whiskies, and I could choose pot still whiskies from different distilleries to show how the character of a distillery varies. For example, I can tell you the character of a pot still whiskey from Ecklandville Distillery is a very different character to the Middleton pot still, to Great Northern Distillery pot still. They've all got different characters, and that's all explainable through the size of the stills and their locations and the different cuts they make, etc. What other tastings can I do? I've listed them here. A blind tasting is something that we don't do a lot of, but I want to do some more of. You could do a blind tasting where nobody knows what they're tasting at all, and you could choose 3 or 4 whiskeys, and that's especially good for people who are experienced drinkers, experienced whiskey drinkers, and they'll get a chance to learn a little bit more about flavors and profiles and notes without the bias of a label, without the bias of age, without the bias of a brand, and they'll be able to choose which one they like, no different than we chose our next Stories and Sips Whiskey Club bottling through a blind tasting, and it's a great way to do it. So those are there's no end to what we can do once we have the whiskies. Now there's more to it in terms of the sequence, which I'll talk about in a second, and what we'll do in terms of keeping that event flowing as well. But again, you're going to gauge your audience, you're going to gauge what their experience levels are, what your goals are, what your budget is, and what your passion is. I mean, you might have a real passion for all things Redbreast, and you want people to taste an entire Redbreast flight from Lustau all the way up to 27, which and I've done that in the past, and it's been extremely well received by those who love pot still whiskey. All right, let me take an old break here for 2 seconds and have a look at the comments. If you've just joined us, you're very welcome. We'd love if you could hit the like button. Thanks, Steve, for reminding. That's all we ask. Hit the old like button and the share button and the subscribe button as well. We're talking about whiskey tastings and hosting your own whiskey tasting and crafting a winning lineup of whiskies. Tonight, let me know what your goals are with a whiskey tasting, and we'll answer and try and work the layout and the structure of a whiskey tasting for whatever you're trying to achieve. Lots of you talking about kind of food pairings and pairing whiskeys with food as well. I'll talk about it in a second as well. Age could be good as well. All right, we'll talk about that as well in a second. So let's talk about it. We move on here. So what do we need beside the whiskey? So obviously the whiskeys we've thought about now, or we're getting some information or some feedback or thoughts maybe forming, or you're getting some ideas from what we've discussed so far between goals and budget and availability and potential lineups that you could provide. What else do you need besides the whiskey? You need water, lots of it. I encourage my guests at the start of a night to drink at least twice as much water as they do whiskey, preferably a lot more. Water is your friend. Most people are not used to drinking liquids at 80 proof and above. You all are whiskey experts, and your palates and tongues and noses have become a little bit more accustomed maybe to the casual drinker, but you're going to need a lot of water. I tend not to be too academic about these things. I'm not looking for specific water. I'm not looking for people to avoid wearing perfume or cologne to a tasting. I'm not getting too academic with it, because above all, I want people to have the crack. Like, a whiskey tasting has to be fun. If it's just somebody lecturing about the academic science of whiskey, there's a time and a place for it. They've not been the most enjoyable events I've been at. The most enjoyable events are where we laugh, we joke, we have a bit of crack, bit of banter as we enjoy the whiskey. So I don't get too academic about it. Glassware. Of course, glassware matters, but I've hosted whiskey tastings with small little plastic shot glasses. I've hosted whiskey tastings with custom designed copitas, and I've hosted whiskey tastings in red solo cups. My most memorable whiskey tasting was on a pontoon boat on a lake with everyone holding their red solo cup, and me with 6 whiskey bottles on a pontoon boat in a lake, while 10 large men in the pontoon boat, probably heavier than the pontoon boat should have been in the lake, all held up their red solo cups for me to pour in the drop of Redbreast or whatever it was I was pouring as we went around the lake. Now, sadly, the pontoon boat went a bit too fast in the lake and had to slow down. But the problem was there was such weight in the pontoon boat that as the pontoon boat slowed down, as you know, if it's going too fast and you hit that brake, you kind of throw it into reverse, the front of the pontoon boat went into the water, and didn't the boat fill with water? Now, the lake was only about 3 feet deep, but lads were jumping out of the pontoon boat thinking we were sinking. There was whiskey bottles floating on the top of the water. I was standing up in the corner, the only corner left of the pontoon boat. It was a slow, wet drive back to the pier. So glassware matters, but the crack matters a bit more. It doesn't matter what you drink out of as long as you enjoy it, but it will affect, of course, the flavor of your whiskey. And again, if you're looking for an academic instruction, there's more of those out there than I can provide. But look, if I have my choice of glassware, I'll use something like a Copita, a Glencairn, a Tua glass. Something that funnels the whiskey to my nose will be ideal, because then I can have a conversation about how the nosing and the flavor appreciation can be affected by the vessel I drink out of. It doesn't mean I can't drink out of a hexagonal glass when I want to. I can. Thank you, Lauren, for the glass. But the tastings, of course, will matter. Now, if I've done tastings with, I think the largest tasting we've done in person was maybe with 150 people, where we had 6 whiskeys, 150 people, 900 glasses we needed. That's a lot. You're not always going to be able to get hold of 900 Glencairns or 900 Tua glasses. So what I've often done in the absence of availability of all of the glassware I need is, if I've got 50 people at a tasting, can I get hold of 50 glasses? So, for example, I just did a tasting recently with 50 people. I brought 50 nosing glasses, and I brought little plastic shot glasses that people could pour into the Glencairn, into the nosing glass between, for each course, for each whiskey course, wash it out with water in between. So it's going to come down to availability as well and cost. Have you got access to whiskey glasses? It'll matter, but not as much as you think. Even small little tumblers are going to be fine, or toothbrush glasses, as I call them, or small little rocks glasses are going to be fine, especially if you're having the crack, you're being educational and entertaining at the same time. But of course, like for example, when we did our silent distillery events, Middleton silent distillery events in Ohio over the last 2 years, it was important to be at the right glassware for those. And even when Kevin O'Gorman, the master distiller, came over last year, he was very keen to find out what glassware we'd have. And he said, like, I'd really love to have copitas for the silent distillery. So we did. So preference, availability, cost. Just don't have people drinking out of the bottle. That's the goal. Fat Daddy wants to know, what's the best tasting you've hosted based on the group, not the whiskeys? Okay, that's a good question. The best tasting I've hosted. I have to think about that one. The best tasting. I've always enjoyed the fundraisers where we've unexpectedly raised more money through maybe a bit of crack on the night. Like I can think back to even night number 1 of our silent distillery event in Ohio in December, where we were trying to raise 30 to 40,000 for charity. And on the first night, one of the guests brought a couple of old bottles of Middleton Very Rare from their storage, from their own collection, and said, look, I want to auction these off on the night. Would you take bids from them? And I want to give all the money to charity. And it was great. And somebody else said, you know what? I run a company that does this. I'm going to throw this in. And then somebody else threw in something. And before we knew it, we'd raised another $20,000 for charity because of the crack that was had from the people and the guests. I love when people that come up to me after an event or share during the event that they've been converted to Irish whiskey, or maybe there was a personal connection or an emotional connection for them with a whiskey or a place that they said, you know what, my family came from Dundalk in County Louth. I never knew that a lot of Irish whiskies come from Dundalk. I'm going to look for whiskies now from Great Northern Distillery or from the Cooley Distillery going forward, and I'm going to be able to tell people that's where my family came from. Those are always fun as well. Daniel wants to know what kind of format you find best received. Well, I think the format really is the one I'm going through right now, which is the setup of the 4 to 6 whiskies. And we'll talk about what I do in terms of the flow of the night in a second. Ice, I have ice available. I tell people it's up to them whether they use it or not. I talk about how it numbs the taste buds, and I don't recommend it for the first sip. Try it neat, try it with a drop of water. And we'll talk about how we deploy kind of ice and water in a second as well. Snacks, so you're wondering about food pairings. What you can pair with whiskey. There's so much you can pair. Lauren was in there talking about cheeses. Dark chocolates work really well. I always like to have a few plain snacks like salted pretzels, even just salted tortilla chips, or something that's not a huge amount of flavor, just something to kind of soak up a little bit of the alcohol at the same time, but also maybe cleanse the palate. Lots of water between courses as well. Tasting mats, you're going to need. Maybe you need tasting mats, maybe you don't. I've done some with tasting mats, some without. It can help for people to keep track of where they are. You don't need a whole lot of information on it, maybe except the name of the whiskey, and let people know which sequence you're tasting it in, which we'll talk about in a second. And then some people love to take notes. Some people love to keep a record of what they're tasting, especially if they like it. They might want to write down what they liked about it. I try and include pictures of the whiskey bottle on my tasting mats when I do it, so that people can recognize the bottle on a shelf later, and they might take a picture of their tasting mat. It's often difficult to remember. Was it Redbreast 12? Was it Redbreast 15 we had? He mentioned something about red, or what is it? Red what? Red spot. So I try and include pictures of the bottles on there as well. The sequence of the whiskies. This is something that gets asked and just got asked quite a bit here now tonight. So this is important, I think. And I think there is a general rule here that's important that I found that works, but you may find a better way. And it's not one rule fits all. And there are a number of ways you can sequence your whiskies. A number of different ways. So what I like to do, and my school of thought, is that I want to build up to the most complex whiskey of the night. I want to start with the lightest whiskey, and I want to build up to the most complex whiskey. A light whiskey will be a grain whiskey that's just been aged in bourbon barrels. That's going to be the lightest Irish whiskey you'll ever find. Going up from that, you might find a blend like a Jameson original, a Bushmills original that have had predominantly bourbon cask maturation, maybe a little bit of sherry. Those will be lighter whiskies, low ABV, and they'll be easy to introduce people to. And it'll be a kind of a soft entrance into the tasting. I'll then work my way up to the most complex whiskey of the night, whether I have 4 whiskeys or 6 whiskeys. In an ideal world, I'll be able to work from the lightest whiskey all the way up to the most complex. Now, when I think about complex whiskeys on the other side of the scale, I'm thinking about whiskeys that might be the highest ABV, that might be the most complex in terms of their maturation. Maybe they have a heavy fortified wine component in terms of, let's say I was serving a Redbreast 27. Now that's a very complex whiskey with many different components and styles of pot still whiskey. And of course, you've got that age, you've got that cask strength nature. That could be a complex whiskey that I don't want to overpower the other whiskey. So why I move from lighter to most complex is that certain whiskeys, the more complex the whiskey, the longer it'll live on in your mouth, in your throat, the more you'll taste it throughout the night. I know many of you will have tasted whiskeys. You say, do you know what? I had a whiskey tasting, or I tasted this thing 2 hours ago. I'm still drinking it. I'm still tasting it. It's still in my mouth, So I like to work up to the most complex. It's not always possible to get it right, but it's also not always possible to do. So I'll give you another example. When we were hosting our silent distillery event, our 2 silent distillery events in Ohio, where the star of the show was a 46 or a 47-year-old whiskey, which people are really coming to taste. It might not have been considered the most complex of them all. There could be, even a Redbreast 27 might be considered even more complex, or a blue spot, dare I say it, cask strength blue spot with 7 to 19-year-old whiskies might be considered by some to be more complex than a 46-year-old whiskey or 47-year-old whiskey. So you might say, well, look, I'll build light to complex, but then I'll also put up one at the end that's the absolute star of the show. Even though it might not be the most complex, it's the one we want to spend the most time on, or it's the hero pour of the night. But this is generally the way I work. I don't generally tend to work on price points. So I don't say start with the cheapest and get to the most expensive, because I don't find that there's a good correlation, especially when you're now finding $200 and $300 5-year-old whiskeys. And you're also finding $150 18-year-old whiskeys. So the price doesn't always correlate with the way you want to go on the tasting. I also don't typically do it in terms of ABV strictly, although I'll use ABV as a way of evaluating the complexity of it. But you might have a sherry and port bourbon combination that is aged for 20 years that's only 46%. I might say, I don't think that is the most complex. I think we're going to put that closer to the start than the end. Now, I've had other people have come up to me and said, what you should do is, if you've got a hero whiskey, start with the hero whiskey. Start with the most complex. Start with the most expensive, because that's when our palate is the freshest. And then allow us to go through the rest of the tasting. In other words, if we've spent hundreds of dollars on a tasting, or in the case of our silent distillery charity events, thousands of dollars on a tasting, leaving the big one to the end, and we've already had 6 or 7 other whiskeys or 5 other whiskeys, is our palate even clean enough to taste it? And I think that's going to come down to a personal decision for you. Which way do you want to go? If I've got a peated whiskey in there, I'll always put the peated smoky whiskey as close to the end as I possibly can, because you just can't get rid of the smoky taste. You can't get rid of it. You might not want to, but it does tend to overpower your taste buds, and it lingers. And so I always put, where possible, the smoky peated whiskey towards the very end. Lauren says I have a habit of losing bottles to water. I do indeed. Jim says lemon sorbet to cleanse the palate. No harm at all. If you have lemon sorbet, brilliant. Great one. Tom says, don't forget your white gloves for the posh effect. Yeah, if you're pouring $45,000 bottles of whiskey, an old pair of white gloves is no harm. However, this Middleton Silent Distillery bottles, which are $45,000 to $50,000 a bottle, they come with silk white gloves. And I've discovered through 2 tastings that those silk white gloves are too slippy to hold the bottle, because the silk And the glass is just an accident waiting to happen. So I've brought my own white gloves, which have a little bit more grip to them. Just cotton white gloves have been even better. Oyster crackers, lots of you have used. Okay, great. Do I share the bottle prices with guests? Absolutely. If anybody, I'll always tell people what the whiskey costs, because they'll often want to know where they can get it. And sometimes they'll be afraid to ask how much it is in case they look too shocked when you tell them. But I'll always tell people what the price of the whiskey is. Robert Richard says, what about doing multiple peated? Absolutely. So you might want to do a peated side-by-side tasting. You might want to have, multiple peated whiskies alongside non-peated whiskies, in which case I would then typically keep the 3 peated whiskies to the end, as opposed to mixing them in with the non-peated blends or single pot stills along the way. So I prefer to go from light to complex along the way. Age, I find, is less important, though it can correlate with complexity, but not always. Not always. Just for example, the Redbreast Dream Cask I just tried, that is this year's Dream Cask, I would argue that's not as complex as even a Redbreast 27. And so you might say, well, a Redbreast Dream Cask is more rare and there's only 800 bottles of it. But again, it depends on your goals too, what you want to achieve. But for me, lighter, working my way up to the most complex. And again, this is all just my way of doing it. You might say, Barry, there's far better ways to do it. Then, whatever works for you, has to be the way to do it. Now, let's say now we know our goals, we know our audience, we know our whiskies, we know our sequence. Obviously, we had the budget figured out because we bought the whiskies. We've got our tasting mats, our water. Now everybody's ready to come in and enjoy the whiskies. Let's talk about the flow of the night. What's going to happen now we've got all of these things in place? The flow of the event. Now, let's start by looking at these 5 points. The first thing you can do is introduce people to Irish whiskey through a welcome cocktail. The Dead Rabbit at their events often serve up an Irish coffee at the beginning of an event. They also serve it at some events at the end of an event. But an Irish whiskey cocktail is a great way to introduce people to Irish whiskey, because again, if you're an Irish whiskey fan, you're more used to drinking Irish whiskey than anybody else that comes to your tasting. So just recognize that not everyone's used to sipping whiskey. Most people are beer drinkers or wine drinkers or vodka Coke drinkers or whatever it is. Most people aren't whiskey drinkers. So we want to find ways to get them into it and comfortably and nicely lead them by the hand into the beautiful world of Irish whiskey. And a cocktail might do that. Caskmates IPA and tonic water and ice is a cocktail that you could serve people. Jameson Orange and Sprite is a cocktail. An Old Fashioned is a cocktail you could use Irish whiskey instead of rye or bourbon. You could do a vodka. Don't ever let me say vodka again. You could do a whiskey ginger. You could do like a highball. Anyway, you can get people to start maybe embracing Irish whiskey at the start of the night, and getting comfortable with the night is a good thing. The next thing I do when I get everybody seated is I introduce the night ahead and tell them what's going to happen. Here's what you should expect. I tell them how long we're going to be here. I tell them how much time we're going to spend per whiskey. I tell them what I'd like them to get out of it, and I ask them what they'd like to get out of it themselves. I will help them understand what's in front of them, how we're going to move through them, why they have things on the table, why there's oyster crackers and water and a pipette for dropping water. I'll help them understand what their tasting mat does. I'll help them understand they move from left to right. I'll help them understand maybe who I am. And I'll show them maybe from a 30,000 foot level what this thing is all about and what they should hope to take away at the end of it. I always share my hope with people that by the end of the event, somebody will say, I'm never drinking bourbon again. Somebody will say, that's it for me. Tequila's done. I'm out. Irish whiskey from now on. And you're trying to be a bit lighthearted. You're trying to get people to understand there's a bit of crack involved in Irish whiskey as well. Because after all, if there's no crack, why do we even bother, right? I'll then give them an overview of Irish whiskey. Now, I want to move as quickly as possible to get them to tasting the thing. Because right now we're an hour and 20 minutes in. I still haven't in our event tonight, but we haven't helped people understand how to taste yet. But we want people to get whiskey on the lips. I wouldn't take more than 5 to 7 minutes before they get to taste whiskey after they sit down. Once they've got the whiskey in their mouths, we can tell them more stories. I'll always begin with a toast when they are tasting the whiskey, but I also want them to understand how to taste it. So I tell them you're going to taste it 3 ways. We're going to nose it. We're going to maybe observe it with the eyes, and we're going to taste it with our mouths. And those 3 things are going to combine to give us the taste and the profile. Always have a few toasts on hand. Help people understand. I have 3 toasts I go to all the time. Very small, very simple toasts. And I'll use them either at every course, every whiskey course, or at the beginning, kind of middle, and the end of the tasting event as well. Mark says, make sure to let them know they'll all sing songs at the end. Songs are optional, but we're always recommended. All right. If you just joined us, you're very welcome. We're talking about tasting Irish whiskey and creating a great lineup for yourself and your friends. Please hit the like button and the subscribe button. That would be very helpful to me as we go through this live stream, talking about how to craft the winning lineup of whiskies for an Irish whiskey tasting. Next, the whiskies. So we're now moving into our sequence. So they're starting with their first whiskey. We've shown them how to taste it, nose it, eye it, etc. And then we want to let people know that, look, this first sip might be a big one because it'll hit you hard and it'll be an overpowering sip maybe, and might be a sip you're not used to. But take a drop of water, add some more water to it, and we help people, get introduced to it as slowly as we possibly can, as comfortably and as enjoyably as we possibly can. If I've got 4 to 6 whiskeys, what I want to do is, I don't want to be an academic. I don't want to lecture them. I don't want to give them facts with no crack. I want to be able to share stories. We call the thing we do stories and sips because the stories of the people and the places behind the pours are, for me, what make the whiskey. So what I'll do between each whiskey is, not only will I explain what they've got in front of them and how broadly that's made, I'll also tell them a story about Irish whiskey or about the people between each one. So I'll separate each sip with a story. And there's any number of stories you can choose from. It could be a story, for example, about how does whiskey get its color. You might explain to people about the maturation process. So you don't want to hurry people through. If you've got 4 to 6 whiskeys, I'd say you take 10 minutes for each whiskey. So, and you tell people don't finish every whiskey if you're not comfortable with it. Take your time. The size of the pours are going to be up to you. I typically do a ½ ounce of a pour, or 15 milliliters of a pour. That's about all you need, I think. Especially if you're drinking 6 whiskeys, that's already 3 ounces of whiskey, which is a lot for people who are not used to drinking whiskey. But you've got stories you can ask, or stories you can share between each single whiskey course. So now you're helping them get introduced to the whiskey, telling them a little bit about it, and then you're giving them a more general character story. You might tell them the first records of distilling came from Ireland, Taiwanese, and Japanese, and Canadian, and American and Scotch whiskies are all derivatives of the original style of whiskey that was distilled in Ireland in the 1300s. You might talk about the rise and fall of Irish whiskey. Great stories to be told there. Kill a few minutes, help people understand a roller coaster ride over the past 800 years of Irish whiskey. You could talk about the characters of Irish whiskey from serving Redbreast. I want to talk about the 45-year legacy of Mr. Billy Lively, master, and his work with Irish distillers from Bushmills to Oak Street to Nichols Distillery. Talk about his efforts. I might talk about somebody like Louise from J.J. Harry, who started the business family farm. So I want people to understand the people, make connections with whether it's historical figures or people who are today working in Irish whiskey as well. So I'm always kind of sharing.
How has the sound gone crazy? I wonder is it like an hour and a half in?
All right, let's see if you can hear me. I just unplugged the USB mic, Steve. Yeah, and just plugged it back in. Let's see if that works. Let me know if you can hear me there. People saying they think it's a YouTube issue after an hour and a half. Could be. Can't be 3 different microphones I've used. Good, says Tom. Right. That's very strange, isn't it? 3 different microphones across 6 sessions have all at an hour and a half. Did nobody put the money in the meter? Loud and clear. All right. Good stuff. All right. Good night, everyone. I'm gone. Anyway, where did I stop? That was only 2 minutes ago. Okay. Madness. So I was saying that between each of the 4 or 6 courses of whiskey, I'll share stories generally to the category. Like I'll talk about the characters of Irish whiskey, maybe the people. I might talk about that like great history of Irish whiskey, the rise and fall of it. I might talk about the records of first distilling in Ireland. I might talk about how whiskey gets its color. So I've got all these great things I can draw from. Maybe the Angel's Share I can talk about that help people kind of paint a picture. So by now I've established what Irish whiskey is. It's got to be aged for 3 years in wooden barrels. Talk about the different styles throughout the 4 first whiskeys that I've served. I'm now on to something more general. Like I'm talking about the people, like Mr. Billy Lighton behind Redbreast. I'm talking about John Jameson. I might talk about Louise McGuan from JJ Corrie and setting up a whiskey bonding company. So it's there's lots I can talk about between courses. So you're trying to build a general awareness of Irish whiskey while also enjoying the little sips we're having and starting to detect the differences between them as you go along. Now, one of the things you've encouraged at the start is feedback and questions. So what I normally say to people is, look, if you've got a question at any time, stop me, raise your hand, shout it out, whatever it is. If it's a large room full of 100, 150 people, as some of the tastings have been, I tend to say to people, look, give me enough time to get through these whiskies and then we can take all the questions you want. And I'll always also ask for a bit of hush, a bit of quietness so that everybody can hear. For larger rooms, I recommend a microphone. I recommend a sound system, but that's not always available. But I'm always reading the room. If the room starts to get out of hand, I've lost them. It means and that typically, when that does happen, it's normally if it's a large group that aren't super interested in whiskey, or they're 3 or 4 whiskeys in and they're 3 sheets to the wind and they don't realize how loud they are. But you can typically keep control of the audience by keeping an eye on the size of the room and their feedback as well as you go. The Angel Share is another thing that you can mention as well as a story kind of between the whiskies. Now, what is something that you should never do? I think I mentioned early on, which is never let the facts get in the way of everyone having the crack. What I mean by that is, Gahan says there's a buzz and echo in his audio now. How is the audio for anybody else? Give your YouTube a refresh. Just do a refresh your page maybe and see if that changes it. And we'll see if everybody else hearing it okay. Hopefully that reset it. Still good for everyone else? Okay. So never let the facts get in the way of having the crack. The goal for me with all my whiskey tastings has never been to drop so many facts that people glaze over, yet have gone home with 100 facts about Irish whiskey, but it's that they had such a great time that they wanted to know when we're all going to Ireland. And that's the goal for me. You might have a different goal, but I would say never be so in love with your own facts and the things you read about or learned about or heard on a podcast or heard me say, or some fact that you want to shove down somebody's throat, whether they like it or not, that gets in the way of having a good old night. And be kind of willing to change the course based on, reading the room. But again, you want to have the crack. So never, I say this with peace and love, seem like you're lecturing or you're telling people what they must do or that they must always drink whiskey a certain way. Or again, if it's only whiskey, it's not that serious, So we want people to have a good old time. Then always read the room. because every room is going to be different and every session you host is going to be very different. And the things I've learned the most from are from whether people tuned out at a certain time or whether people didn't have any interest in certain stories. There's stories I used to tell that people have no interest in. There's others that people want to know every single time. There's approaches to the format that people have said work best than others. So if I'm reading the room, getting the feedback, encouraging questions, I'm able to learn a lot more about the flow of the event, how it's going, and what people enjoy. Remember, you're trying to achieve a goal. Mine is to get more people to enjoy Irish whiskey. So if people leave there saying, yeah, it was okay, but the event itself was so underwhelming for them that they don't even think about the whiskeys again, then it's not been a success for me. So I'd always be trying to read the room and learn from it, and see what people are responding to. But again, don't take too long on the whiskies. Don't take too long on one individual story. And the more you can keep it snappy and moving and boom, 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 you're able to get people through a great tasting, have a bit of crack, and yes, maybe get them towards a song at the end as well. When I used to do my in-person tastings, sometimes we did one or two of them a week in Ohio back in 2016, 17. I would line up all the bottles of whiskey on the floor in a line, and I then ask every person to name their favorite whiskey, and I would move that whiskey forward on the floor one bottle width, and then everyone would vote. And as they're voting, we're moving the bottles along. And it's almost like a little bit of a steeplechase with the bottles. And by the end of it, by the time you've got to all the folks there, you've got a number of whiskeys, or you've got one whiskey that has reached the finish line or the furthest ahead than all the others, and that's your winner. You don't really need to do anything with that information. It's just, this was the winner tonight. And I've hosted tastings 3 or 4 nights in a row with the same whiskies, where every single night it's been a different winner. And that's the beauty of Irish whiskey, is that there's no one lineup that's going to work. But you might discover that on 3 whiskey tastings that you've done for your friends, one whiskey just keeps bombing, and you might decide nobody likes it. Maybe it's just not the one for them. So you might drop it out of your lineup and move something else into the rotation as well instead. Have the crack. That is all that matters. All that matters to me anyway is that we have the crack and we leave having had a good time. All right, let me have a look at some of your questions there. So what do you think? Have we got some information now on kind of structuring and laying out a whiskey tasting and potentially how to format an event or an experience around the whiskies, rather than just saying, all right, we've got this much, we've got these whiskies, let's just talk facts about them and let's get all academic. And again, the nosing and the tasting, it's fun, but it's not everything. Everything is having a good time in the night, like having a great night out, making sure that people get home safely, making sure that they've enjoyed themselves as much as they've been educated. For me, that's everything. And again, like, I've been to some really academic tastings that have their place. I'd much rather have a great night out where sometimes people talk too much while they're sipping the whiskies, and we have to quiet them down, but it's because they're having such a good time and they're talking about the whiskies, and they're they really are having the crack around the selection. And then you can always finish your night with a song, whether you can sing or not. Me not being able to sing has never stopped me singing a song, and I've relied on the old triangle. I've got I think I have a video here of the first ever night, my first ever whiskey tasting, that I'm going to find for you here. And it's very different to how we do tastings now, but let me pull it up. Go back far enough, we'll find it. Go way back here on my phone. Somewhere here. Talk amongst yourselves anyway. All right, let's find the year, the month. You can tell how little this is rehearsed. Okay, here it is. Let me see if I can pull it up on the screen. Maybe we can add a camera. Give me a second. Present. Oh yeah, extra camera. Here we go. No, it's not liking that. Okay, I'll hold it up to the camera and you'll see it instead. This is the first ever whiskey tasting.
And my presence when jingle, jingle, all along the banks of the Royal Canal.
I'm a one-trick pony. We haven't changed the song in 7 years. So that was the first ever whiskey tasting. Started with the Old Triangle, and it's stuck. It was a bit of crack, and we've done it ever since. So that is it for my recommendations on hosting a whiskey tasting. Any good? Any help? Let me know. Excellent insight and guidance, as Jennifer. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, no problem at all. No problem. If this was helpful, let me know. Again, I want feedback. I need to know if this is helpful to you, if this is good. There's no one way to do the tastings, of course. Like I said, like that's just the way I've hosted them over the years, and what I've learned works the best. But when you ask yourself those questions again, what am I trying to do? Who's it for? What's my budget? What are available whiskies? And then layer in the sequencing. You've got the bones of a great whiskey tasting lineup. So you probably came here tonight saying he's going to tell me exactly what whiskies we're going to choose for our best whiskey tasting. And I'm not, and I didn't, unfortunately. But instead gave you all the tools you need to make your own decisions. Own decisions. There's no right way. There's no wrong way. It can be a $20 bottle of whiskey. It can be a $200 bottle of whiskey. It can be a $2,000 bottle of whiskey. Just have the crack. That's all you want to do. Have a bit of fun. Jason Thornton in Australia is obsessed with me going to Donegal. No, Jason, I'm not heading to Crawley soon. Crawley Distillery is about a 12-hour hike from me, from Cork, and that's a long way to go to taste whiskey that doesn't come from the distillery. But Jason, you might get there quicker from Australia than I'll get there from Cork. So you learned about the 3 whiskies that were announced this week. You got teased a picture of the whiskey that's going to be announced by Stories and Sips next week, hopefully. And we talked about how to craft an ideal whiskey tasting. What should we cover in our next Shebeen? What do you want to know about? I'm still sipping on the port, Ruby Port from Thomangate. Fat Daddy has given friends flights in sample bottles to try on their own with his own notes. Very good. There's a great community that builds up around a passion. And you see it in the beer world, craft beer world. You see it now increasingly in the world of whiskey. You don't see many vodka clubs. You don't see many gin clubs. You see a lot of craft people who talk about the craft of beer making, the craft of distilling. We might argue that there isn't as much craft to vodka or gin making. We might argue, although we might be shot down by the vodka and gin makers. But we tend to, what I've discovered is that we tend to gravitate towards people who have a passion about a thing and can talk about the emotional side of things and the struggles and the stories and the history of a subject matter. And whiskey is full of those things. It's full of the people, it's full of the places, and it's full of just amazing examples of humanity and flavor all at the same time. Mark says we should do a club blind tasting online. Yeah, we'll definitely consider that. We'll definitely consider it. Greg says, do you give some swag at tastings? Not typically, Greg. I don't typically give anything. I mean, sometimes I do a tasting for 100, 150 people, and you wouldn't be able to give enough. You wouldn't be able to give anybody anything, just with costs and things like that. Sometimes if a brand was to sponsor an event, maybe, but I don't do sponsored tastings by brands anymore. Just all kind of independent stuff. Sometimes for corporate events, they have sent swag. So if I do, let's say a bank wants to, or a finance company wants to bring in 30 of their best clients, they might send glassware and t-shirts and all kinds of swag. They might send them, but I typically don't. Steve says, give it a miss next week. No, there's feedback. I asked for feedback. There's another question here. Oh, yes. Jason's question there reminded me. So for those of you joining our next Whiskey Bus, we are going to be joined by Fionnán O'Connor, whiskey historian and man of great crack. I talked to him on the phone the other day. He's in California at the moment, avoiding the world of Irish whiskey so he can finish his thesis. And he's working away on his thesis there, but he'll be back in time for at least one night on our Whiskey Bus during our adventures in August, the end of August. So we're looking forward to seeing Fionnán, and those of you who are joining our Whiskey Bus will again benefit from the oracle of knowledge, loquacious oracle of knowledge that is Fionnán O'Connor. Amy asks, how do you decide to charge what to charge for the event? That's a great question, and something I should have covered maybe. What to charge for the event. So back to the goal of the event. And what are we trying to do? So if I'm doing a fundraising event, so the goal of the event is just to raise money, I'm going to want to charge as much as is reasonably possible for the event, where I know as much of that money is going to charity as possible. You're then balancing that with what's reasonable for people to pay, or what are people likely to pay. And I've learned from being involved in some whiskey tastings over the past few years that where fundraisers have set a price that's just too high and the thing doesn't sell out. And you're always you don't always get that right. So if it's a fundraiser, you're going for as much as you can, but you're conscious that there's only so much people will spend on 6 whiskeys or 5 whiskeys, for example. It'll depend on who's going there. If I've got a corporate client, they maybe have more budget available to spend per person, or more corporate people who are attending from a business perspective might be able to expense it, so they may be able to pay more. If it's just friends and family, I don't know, like I don't charge individually for tastings anymore, in the sense of there was a time where I did a lot of in-person tastings for Irish distillers in Ohio, where most of those tastings were free tastings or very low cost tastings, maybe charged by the bar to cover the cost of some food or something like that. If you're hosting one at home, it's up to you. If you want people to just cover the cost of the whiskeys, but again, it comes back to the goal. Do you offer a free tasting to your friends just because they're your friends and you want to have a bit of crack and a bit of fun with them? If you're trying to do it for profit, it's a whole different story altogether. What are your costs? What is the value in your time? What's your own experience worth? What do you have to cover there? Is there travel involved? All those factors will be factored in. If I'm doing corporate events right now, which is kind of the only way I have the physical time to be able to do in-person events, where we're doing them for a large company or a large group, I might have to factor in how much it costs to get there, and overnight stays and hotels, and more than just time, and then the whiskeys themselves. So I'll always ask what the budget is for whiskeys, what the budget is for X and Y, and then we'll price things accordingly. So bit by bit, one by one. If you've got anything in mind, Amy, like for a specific event or something, I'd be happy to chat offline. Just message me about it kind of separately, and can figure out a pricing matrix or something for you. But it's the classic answer of it depends. It depends. So yeah, like 2 interesting comments there. Like Amy saying, what is it that you should find? What is it I find a beginner is usually willing to spend? And Don saying Total Wine has classes for about $20. See, there's a big difference between somebody independently hosting a whiskey tasting and a brand. If if Tullamore or let's say Jameson wants to get people into Jameson whiskies, they're going to host a tasting. It doesn't cost any money because that is their cost, is to put on these tastings. And their team is already paid. It's put on by a brand ambassador who's on a salary, who's paid to do it. They've got a budget for giveaways, for whiskey, for swag, and there's no cost involved. When it's an independent person, like, I don't get the whiskey for free. If I'm doing a whiskey tasting, I have to buy all the whiskeys. If I just did a whiskey tasting that involved a 33-year-old Bushmills, I bought the 33-year-old Bushmills at retail price. And so that cost has to be recovered, so we have to at least cover the cost of the retail price of the whiskeys because we're not getting them for free. So I think independently, if you're hosting a whiskey tasting, you have to pay for the whiskey, you have to pay for your time, you have to pay for your snacks and your food and room rental if you're doing something, and then look at, well, is that reasonable to charge people? If you decide you want to pour Bushmills 33-year-old and you've got 10 people coming to your whiskey tasting, before you've poured another whiskey, you need at least $150 per person to break even on that one bottle. And then you might discover nobody cares to spend $150 just because you want to taste Bushmills 33-year-old. So that's a challenge as well, isn't it? So we can do it we can figure it out individually. All right, folks. So Sinead, we went on. We talked for quite a bit here, almost 2 hours. Stay tuned. Hopefully this week we'll have news on our Stories and Sips Whiskey Club release. We'll have more news on an upcoming Meet the Maker event. And we're trying to nail down our next quarterly tasting as well, which we hope will happen in the next 6 weeks or so. So there's a lot happening, and it's a busy, busy time in the world of Irish whiskey. Expect to see lots more releases in the coming months. There's a few that are coming to the United States that I've got wind of that I think you'll be excited about. And we'll be sharing those details as soon as we have them on our Facebook page and Twitter and our group, our Irish Whiskey Fans of America group. If you're not yet a member of our Stories and Sips Whiskey Club, I might as well throw in the old pitch for it. We're a whiskey club, and we are predominantly comprised of members from the United States who enjoy diving deeper into the world of Irish whiskey. And we have exclusive whiskey releases and tasting events and online events and a chance to meet the people behind the whiskey, and online content and podcasts and videos and great deep dives into the world of Irish whiskey, all available at storiesandsips.com/club. It costs $20 a month and you can cancel anytime. So, for example, if you wanted to join just because there was an upcoming whiskey that you had your eye on, you wanted to cancel afterwards, I don't have any problem with that. That's up to you. We prefer people to stay because I think there's crack to be had, and we've got lots of members who've been here with us now for a year and a half, and it's been great crack, and more crack to be had, and lots more conversations being had with whiskey companies and brands to do nice things together. Join after the Dunvilles release, says Greg. So, to give you the last thing I'll leave you with is that we have an allocation of whiskey of X number of bottles. And how the finances and kind of logistics of our club works is that, from the back end side of things, is that I have to buy all the whiskey in advance. Whether it sells or not is not of any concern of the whiskey company, honestly, at the end of the day, because they have to make their money back on the whiskey they sell me, or sell our, the club buys, not me personally. And then that has to be then moved on to club members. If we don't sell out, we are stuck with kind of working capital tied up in stock that might not move. So we like things to, at least recoup our costs on these things, obviously. So the next whiskey we're embarking on is the oldest whiskey to date. It's the most expensive whiskey we'll have ever released. It is the most expensive whiskey that we will have ever purchased ourselves as a club, because the cost of whiskey at the moment is very, very high. It's a whiskey that's older than the age of drinking in Ireland. That's the only clue I've given you on that. But we have an allocation of a smaller number of bottles than we typically have, and that's because it's a much higher price point, and I think it's going to preclude a percentage of our club from purchasing, and that's okay. Not every whiskey we release will be for everybody, but what we'll be doing is we'll be doing a pre-sale, and if the pre-sale determines that, or if we determine from the pre-sale that there is a greater demand than the number of bottles that exist, then we will make the acquisition of additional bottles exclusively for us. So that's why we're doing a pre-sale this time, is to lock people in and say, look, you can buy 5 bottles of this thing if you want, 10 if you want, and if there's more demand, we'll be able to get more of this than we'll first release. If we don't, have pre-sale demand, we will stick with our original allocation, and that whiskey which would have been set aside for us will eventually be blended away into something else. It'll never see the market. It'll be blended away. So that's kind of, I'll talk more about that and I'll answer any of your questions when we go live on that, and we'll do a live stream about it and take all your questions on it. So that's it. Thanks everybody. Good night. So and I will share more details with you all as soon as I have them on the bottle. I won't answer some of your questions there until I have firm answers for you. All right. So sláinte. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you during the week in our group, Irish Whiskey Cans of America, and online Stories and Sips. Sláinte everybody.